I feel, stimulated by what's gone before, and I hope to build on it, but in a questioning way, because I don't have a complete answer to the kinds of questions that I'm posing, which are very similar to Jeremy's. So this theme, community and activism, when I was asked to speak, I thought, well, that sounds good. And then in the lumbering up process, thinking, what on earth can I focus on? I mean, it's such a huge sort of issue. And Agnes and also Natalie Fenton suggested, well, just link it to what you're already preoccupied with. And I have to say, a bit like with Jeremy, I'm increasingly, I'm preoccupied increasingly by political questions. So that yesterday, I don't have a television license, but I kept sneaking on to my sort of online, replaying of both Channel 4 News and Newsnight. I thought, oh my God, I'm becoming a sort of political addict. So, but I'm not, I can sort of reassure you, going to talk about the shadow cabinet as a community and how it can become a community. But I will, towards the end, go back to the kinds of questions that Jeremy was addressing about momentum and what kind of community could be created or not, and also the different kinds of leadership that might involve, very different from the kind of leadership being demanded of Corbyn over the shadow cabinet. But first I just thought I should sort of give some historical mapping, building on what Phil and Jeremy said about ideas of community in relation to politics, because in a way that's my theme, community and politics, or the politics of community. And I think that it has been both a political football, but also it's a concept which has can be highly political, but also can be apolitical. So I've been subscribing to the Institute of Economic Affairs, the sort of neoliberal institute, just in order to understand what the enemy is up to. And I was just sort of casting a casual eye over my bookshelves when I was thinking about this talk, and I saw a book called Community Without Politics by the IEA. And so I kind of devoured this, not exactly with enthusiasm, but with curiosity. And I think just to give a sense of at least the past that I've experienced of the relation between community and politics. So there was a time in the 70s when there was a kind of proud tradition of community politics. In a way, it was a reaction to both the failure of the sort of Wilson government, and in that sense of government and politics as government, but also faced with corporate power, a feeling that some kind of purposeful activity was necessary, but one couldn't look to government or to the Labour Party. So that when I think it was a Tory government introduced community development projects in a way to deal with the problem of the poor and set them up all over the country, mainly on the analysis of trying to build self-help and the kind of overcome a culture of sort of victim consciousness, and this kind of notion that if only working class people would build some kind of community, then all the kind of problems of poverty and so on would be overcome. And as it happened, most of the people employed in these projects were all people saying, hang on a minute, actually there's something else going on. These were in places like Newcastle, Coventry, where major corporations, were actually destroying communities. So that led to a whole conscious movement of kind of building communities as a source of transformative power. And I think that's really one of the kind of themes that I want to address, which is about community in relation to power, which raises all these issues that Jeremy touched on about the relation of community to agency, how far one can talk about a purposeful community, what are the sort of conditions of community becoming a form of agency. And it's as if, this whole sphere of community is a kind of, not just a political football, but almost like a holy grail, a sort of contested sphere for something which is an answer to the crises of today, on which the left and the right are sort of competing, but with very different conceptions. And it's maybe important to try and be more explicit. So that at the same time as this community politics was developing itself and asserting itself as a dimension of politics distinct from party politics and sort of looking to achieve a Labour government, but actually sort of saw power being built from below, a kind of complement to an often attempt to overcome the limits of trade union power, which was too exclusively linked to the workplace. We saw the development of the free market right and the kind of notions of the market as a conscious alternative to, well, not conscious in a way, haphazard alternative to the state. So if you read Hayek, which I felt I ought to do, not specifically for this, but sort of in the past, you know, he's very purposefully talking about the need for a recognition of the market as a key means of achieving order without purpose, you know, in a way building on what Jeremy was saying about, you know, the sort of denigration of purposeful, intentional activity, and the idea that our intentions can produce, at least in a limited way, the kind of ends to which we intend them to. So in a way, that whole idea of the market as a kind of sphere of haphazard convergence through the price mechanism was crucial to the free market rejection of the state, and by politics they mean the state. And so community without politics, from what I've read, rather cursory skimming, is in a sense an attempt, a recognition post-Thatcher really, that one can't just rely on the free market, you know, that there are social problems that require something else, but God forbid that could mean the state. So instead it's a kind of search for, in a way, a kind of social equivalent of the individual entrepreneurial kind of notions underpinning the market as a haphazard source of order. So in a way, the kind of descriptions of community that this guy David Green from the IEA gives is of a kind of social haphazardness. So in a way, almost the neighbour as an equivalent to the entrepreneur, sort of being kind of helpful and caring, and somehow the sort of aggregate of that adds up to a notion of community. So a kind of notion of community without any sense of purpose, without any sense of deliberation, without any sense of sharing knowledge. And I want to come on later to the importance of knowledge and an understanding of practical knowledge. In a way, when I did read Hayek, I was kind of shocked, because he was using all these concepts about things we know but cannot tell, practical knowledge. You know, I thought, hang on a minute, these are concepts I've come across through the women's movement, of which I'm a proud member, and how it was, I mean, there's less of a movement now, I have to admit. It's a bit more like Jeremy's description of the anti-capitalist movement. But anyway, and through shop stewards movements that all talked about practical knowledge. But the key thing was that Hayek saw that practical knowledge as totally individual. He had, in a way, both an essay on knowledge, highlighting the importance of practical knowledge, the things we know but cannot tell, and then an essay on the individual, the importance of the individual. And his notion of practical knowledge was that it was entirely, almost constitutionally, individual. So hence, you couldn't have any sort of deliberative sort of conscious sharing of knowledge. It was a kind of contradiction in terms, and any attempt to think about social knowledge was bound to be dictatorial and lead to the kind of notions of the state as a kind of benign force, which he was, you know, his whole rationale was to critique. So that led me to think, well, actually, if we think about social movements like the women's movement, like the shop stewards movement, like most, you know, the Green movement and so on, what are they? What were they? What have been the kind of basis of their forms of organisation? Actually, it has been about sharing knowledge. So the women's movement, its consciousness-raising groups, were about sharing knowledge that was very individual, you know, and had been dismissed as just gossip. So we shared experiences, but then made sense of that and developed, in a way, a kind of basis for conscious activity, for purposeful activity that wasn't predictable. So it wasn't a sort of positivistic understanding of knowledge. It was knowledge as being having many different sources, as being plural, as being not just about sort of constant correlations that could predict outcomes and so on, but being about understanding relationships, mechanisms and so on that could produce in ways that couldn't be completely predicted because of all the different forces at work, outcomes that one could act on, and one could act on the sort of mechanisms involved. So there was a different understanding of knowledge implicit in movements, and also I think implicit in community, which in a way that whole discussion about all this whole issue of the relation between movements and community, can one talk about a community having the potential to be a movement, and what are the conditions for that? Is it to do with sharing knowledge and sources of dynamic? Is a movement a community in action? I mean, these are things I don't know the answer to, but one reason I'm so excited to be here is and I saw 58 pages worth of abstracts, so I thought there must be answers in that. So I'm looking forward to the rest of the 3 days, even if I can't be here for all of it. So this takes us back to power, and I think, because here clearly in this notion of movements as socializing knowledge, and this counter, in a way, the sense in which the movement left, the new left if you like, though that needs a lot of discussion, can provide answers to Hayek in a way in which the old statist left can't. But that leads on to the need for a more complex understanding of power. So I want to, drawing on other people, emphasize the importance and the political implications of a distinction between what John Holloway and also Roy Basker talk about as power over, power as domination, which often is associated with power as government, and power to, or power as transformative capacity. And that in a way, let's go back to the women's movement, I mean, that was a sort of exemplary case of power as transformative capacity, so that, our capacities as women, once we became conscious of them, were on the one hand an aspect of reproducing our oppression, reproducing in the sort of conventional family relations and acceptance of male domination, being complicit in a way in our oppression, or the basis of refusal and the beginnings of the development of alternatives. So the women's movement wasn't just about lobbies on government. It wasn't just saying we want the equal pay, so we will, take a bus down to Westminster and lobby Barbara Castle. It wasn't just about we want more nurseries, so we'll go and lobby the government on that. It was also about action in the here and now, so that Ford workers took action to achieve equal pay. Many women's groups actually organised nurseries, and then on that basis, in a way, turned to power as domination as a resource, sort of demanding a different use of public resources to change the state in a way, to support these transformative kind of initiatives. And I mean, I think when we come on to think about momentum and so on, I think that also applies to the question of the party. Can the party be a resource for transformative initiatives, transformative power that's autonomous from the party? So we had one very interesting example is New Deal for Communities, an initiative by Tony Blair, which in a way echoed this sort of community without politics. So that was based on a recognition of, oh my God, that there is inequality, but we're not going to do anything about it at a macro level. That would involve too much state intervention, too much of the old, statist left that we're trying to break from. So let's do some micro interventions in the worst kind of estates. And they had a kind of competition in they would locate areas like Newcastle, Coventry, Luton, all sorts of different places, and say, and identify the most underprivileged poor estates, and have a competition between community groups to get resources, considerable resources, something like 10 million or something over 5 years. I did a bit of research looking at these different experiences, and what it highlights is the difference between communities that were kind of in a way harnessed as accessories to government, and communities that developed a sense of purpose and a sense of themselves as agencies of social change. So in East Manchester, there was a New Deal for Communities, which were really, the community was kind of, it had no autonomy. I mean, some groups in it did, and they were kind of actually often marginalised, but the community was sort of, you know, there to be consulted with and so on, but actually never developed a sense of agency. Whereas in Luton, where the group that won involved a very savvy sort of group of young people who'd organised occupations and all sorts of things against sort of the whole rave. I don't know, there was that bill of Thatcher's which was setting the number of decibels over which, you know, it was illegal to go in any kind of party or rave.
94 Criminal Justice.
The 94 Criminal Justice Act. It was major, okay. So they'd reacted against that and formed a group called the Exodus Collective, you know, looking to Bob Marley as their kind of spiritual and political leader. And they then saw, you know, being savvy, one of them was an ex-Aslef shop steward, 10 million, wow, we could do something with that. So they got together with vicars, tenants associations, all sorts of different people and bid for the money and were successful, although a lot of, you know, people said to me, you know, there's real anxiety, you know, in the Cabinet Office about the Exodus Collective and blah, 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 blah. So there was a sort of anxiety about it from the beginning. But they went about then creating a sort of purposeful community in a very skilled kind of way, and have successfully, after a lot of struggles and so on, established a kind of hub which, you know, lots of them, when you talk, they sort of compare it, contrast it with the miners', you know, communities, and saying, you know, we're trying to build a conscious kind of hub like the miners had in the working men's clubs. I mean, not a bit rather limited hub, but this is going to be a kind of open hub. And I won't go into more detail because I've got a limited amount of time. So in a way, well, this is leading me to you know, how far one can talk about a sort of notion of autonomy. So in a way, this notion of community that they built in Luton was recognising the autonomy of different groups constituting it, but on the other hand, trying to build a kind of common alliance, and out of that produce a sort of purposeful actor. And I think in a way this leads to sort of a distinction between community as platform or community as base. I mean, another example would be Women Against Pit Closures, who were kind of defending their communities, the mining communities, but they did it in a way which reached out, that built alliances. You know, they all came down to London. Well, not all, but London was just one hub that they tried to harness, and did so well politically successfully, but not in terms of saving the pits. But that also leads on to something I want to say later about the importance of memory, because and kind of learnt political practices. So the women involved in that, okay, it was a defeat, but they've now gone on. If you investigate and map, and I think this is really important, what's happened to that kind of grouping. You go up to Barnsley and, no, that's I'll put it on snooze, but that's not an invitation to you. Okay, it's 1 minute, okay. So, you know, they've now created purposeful communities in places like Barnsley around housing, around all sorts of different anti-sort of poverty, anti-austerity kind of issues. So that importance of memory in the building of a purposeful community. So it's a difference between community as platform and base, and in a way a kind of base for transformative power. And I think there, I'd say, there's the question of campaign and movement, but there's also the question of initiative. You know, that in a way, a lot of what the Women Against Pit Closure people or the Luton people have done is not so much either a movement or a campaign. It's often an initiative that has then maybe led to some kind of wider movement or even been a base for a campaign. But the difference between that, community as platform and base, and community as sort of a closed community. Those communities as platform and base is like the notion of an open community, a dynamic community, and community is a closed phenomenon, a sort of tribal or sometimes family kind of entity. And I think, in a way, that's Corbyn's choice with Momentum. Will it be created as a kind of closed community, or an attempt to change the Labour Party as a closed community? Or will it be an attempt to build transformative power, autonomous from the Labour Party, but able to both be a base for changing society and changing the Labour Party, and a base for a different kind of government? And I was going to describe the Hackney Momentum and its limited characteristics, but I won't because there's no time, just as an example of this, and then go on to say something about how we break out of that, and there talk about both communicative, the importance of communicative tools as a way of building an open community. So they're the kind of Podemos example, or the kind of issue of investigation and developing drawings on structures of sharing knowledge as a way of breaking out, where mapping, I think, is crucial, and mapping forms of productive community that actually producing new kinds of economic activity. And I'll just end by saying that I think for this development of open communities, and this being the choice facing Corbyn and Momentum, I think that Jeremy Corbyn actually has got the kind of leadership capacity for this open kind of process, that in a sense, I only went to one of his rallies, but it was very striking that what he was doing really was actually, in Phil's words, he was actually putting ordinary people's lives on the map. So it wasn't one of these, his speeches are not like great eloquent, demagogic, well, I wouldn't say Tony Benn was demagogic, but, that kind of eloquence that is mapping a big picture. He's much more telling the stories that have come out of his own surgery in Islington that he is part of every week, and making those stories significant, and the people at the receiving end of those stories significant. And I think, in a sense, that can be his role in the development of Momentum as a transformative, or a catalyst and resource for transformative activity, putting not just people's lives, but people's actual attempts to bring about change, and in doing so help to turn initiatives into some kind of organised movement.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. And we have people on the panel representing very different factors and approaches to local and community media. They're each going to talk for about 10 minutes, and then we're going to have a bit of a round table type discussion, and if possible I'd like to engage as many people in the auditorium as possible.